A warm welcome and good evening or good afternoon or good day to you, no matter what part of the world you're in. This is the Buddhist Art Workshop. It's a virtual tour of Maijishan and the caves at Mogao, just outside of Dongguan in China. And right off the bat, I'm going to say my slides are not quite as fancy as some of the other presentations that I've done, because these are very large sites. So we're just going to really scratch the surface, but I hope that you'll see just some of the beauty of what's there, and also we'll have a chance to do a little bit of a breakout session and do a little bit of engagement with each other about midway through. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and share screen. And, as I have been doing all along, please know that we're going to try to hone in on some details. And if at any point you can't see what I'm talking about, then by all means, just call it out, and I will try to adjust from my end. But for now, can everyone see the first slide there? Visual tour of Buddhist art, Maijishan and Mogao caves. And just to say, all of this material is from the master's program at the Courtauld that I did in master's degree in Buddhist art history and conservation, and a trip that our group actually took to see these locations. So there's more information about it on my blog, on the blog of the community. But this first image is a beautiful image, and it's very, I would say, kind of emblematic of what we see at Dongguan. We're going to talk about, so the Mogao caves are near the city of Dongguan. Sometimes they're called Dongguan caves. And what we have here is we have Manjushri. Manjushri is the Bodhisattva of wisdom. I would say perhaps one of the most beloved bodhisattvas, right up there with Guan Yin, the Bodhisattva of compassion. Manjushri is one of the most beloved bodhisattvas in China. He's thought to reside on Mount Wutai in China. And he rides, traditionally he rides on a lion. And if you're looking at this image for the first time, you might not be able to tell what we're talking about here. So this is the lion. This is, you might see the mouth of the lion here, and the nose and the eyes and the little ears of the lion. And that's Manjushri, and he has this this halo is usually called the nimbus, this one right around the head. And then this larger one around the body is often called a mandorla. A mandorla is this sort of full-on body halo, which is for awakened beings. All right, so we'll just keep going on. Everyone, you can see that I'm recording this, so there'll be access to the recordings. I also usually, if folks are interested, oh, Claudia's here. So I'll just stop for one moment because I need to start the interpretation, so that will get recorded. Hola, Claudia. Okay. All right. There we are again. Okay. And so in any event, yeah, if folks want to, you can put your email in the chat, and I will also send you a link to the slides, because the slides will have links to more information about many of these pieces of art we're going to see. Okay, and now will it let me advance? It will not. Okay, sorry folks, technical difficulties here. Give me a moment. Okay. Let's try that again. Okay, one more time with feeling. Everybody can see the slides? Great, thank you. All right. So where are we talking about? What part of the world are we talking about? So there are many cave monastery sites in China. It was a very, very common act of devotion over a very long period of time, from about the 3rd century all the way into the 13th century. And so you have many, many different sites there, sometimes called the caves, as you can see here, sometimes called temples, sometimes called grottos, carvings. They're all different ways of referring to them. This little B here, this is Beijing, just modern day Beijing, the capital of China, just so you can see, you know, a little bit about what part of the world we're talking about. So the caves that we're looking at today are the Maijishan, which is about here, and the Mogao over here. So this is northwestern China. And both of them are at opposite ends, more or less, of Gansu province. So here in the inset, you can see that China is much bigger than this, actually, and this is just a piece of it there. But we're just showing you this a little bit to get a sense of the way that it is set up, what we're looking at here. And then, as it says on the slide there, it is between the so-called northern and southern Silk Roads. We'll take a look at that in a minute, with the Taklamakan Desert to the west and the Gobi Desert to the south. So it's a very, very dry, arid area. And that's Mogao. And Maijishan is near Tianshui. It's a beautiful forested area, so have a look at that. So the Silk Road, just to say a little bit about that, because it had a tremendous influence on all of Buddhist art history, I would say. The Silk Road is the name that was much later given in the 1800s, was when this name was applied to a whole series of routes. It's not a single road, and you can see them here. This is a display that they have at the Gansu Provincial Museum in Langzhou. And this blue route is what we call the Maritime Silk Route. And then we have the northern Silk Routes, you know, Silk Road here in the white and green. And then we have the southern in the yellow and yellowish red. And, you know, everything passed along these roads: people, merchandise, ideas, and that created this beautiful and complex, very rich cross-cultural exchange around the world. So Mogao is out here. So, but first we're going to look at Maijishan. So this is Maijishan. And the name means wheat stack mountain. And you see it right here. It's named because of the shape of this particular rock formation that rises up very clearly out of the forest. And, you know, when I arrived there, I could imagine, you know, centuries ago, pilgrims who walked, you know, thousands of miles in some cases to come to this place, and they would see this formation, you know, from far away. It was the caves began to be constructed here by a meditation master named Shuang Kao. And I haven't done a lot of background into him, but as I understand it, he's called meditation master because his lineage is not clear, what kind of lineage he was practicing in. But that was late 4th century, early 5th century. And that was the beginnings. Many of the caves, I would say, I think somebody said something like 70% of the caves here were actually carved, though, in the northern Zhou dynasty period, so 6th century. And still, this site was active for many, many, many years, hundreds and hundreds of years. It was given a National Cultural Relic status in 1961, which means to us as visitors that the Chinese have recognized it as a place where they apply resources and staff to try to conserve it. And that's a good thing. That helps us to be able to come and visit. So that this is a monastery, and it's a bit unusual. So the cave sites were all run by Buddhist monastics, as far as we know. And nonetheless, most of the time what happens is that when the sites become these tourist locations, when they get decided as cultural relic or put on the UNESCO cultural heritage sites, usually the monastics get run off. They send the monastics away, and the sites are cared for by professional museum conservationists and other kinds of art, historical, and engineering professionals. But in this case, in Maijishan, there are still monastics who live there to this day. They don't actually live in the caves themselves, but they do live and practice there on the site. There are 194 caves that are said to have survived, and that means survived the earthquakes. Is an area where there's a very common occurrence of earthquakes. And 7,200 sculptures there. This image just to the right there is a lovely example. It's a photo that I took there of one of the caves. And what we see here is a central image of the Buddha. And we know that because, let me make it a little bit larger if I can. We know that because he has this ushnisha, is what it's called, the sort of protrusion on the head, right? Which is, there are debates about whether that's hair or whether that's some kind of actual, thing that he was born with. But most of the time it's understood in the tradition to be a sort of sign of his wisdom, that once his wisdom grew to a certain extent that he had to accommodate it. And you see this tiny little curls of hair, that's these little dots appearing things here. You see the urna, so this is a spot that is specifically mentioned in many of the later suttas as being able to emit light and things of that nature. But even as far back as the very earliest Buddhas, we would see the urna there, this sort of mark on the forehead that was described about the historical Buddha. And we see these elongated earlobes. So the elongated earlobes are a reference usually to Shakyamuni Buddha, the historical Buddha, who lived and woke up in India in roughly the early part, or rather the late part of the 6th century, plus or minus 100 years. And he was part of a noble family, so he had these long earlobes from the heavy earrings that he would wear, but they didn't have the earlobes anymore because that's part of what he gave up when he left the palace life. And so in a way, it symbolizes his renunciation, but to me, it also symbolizes his independence from the ruling clans of his time. So those are the ways that we know that this is a Buddha. We see a distinctly Chinese form of the robe here, this particular kind of beautiful patterning on the robe and the way that it's tied there. That's not how we usually would see it depicted in India, for example. It would be more simple than that, much more simple. And then we have a couple of lovely smiling bodhisattvas here with this Buddha. Oh, and this Buddha, of course, has this lovely kind of rainbow-colored nimbus here, and a very distinctly Chinese style of depiction of clouds, sort of curly cues on the clouds. And then we have these standing bodhisattvas here who are attending to the Buddha. So yeah, that's one of the niches. Whoop. Sorry, folks, my navigation today. There we go. Yep. And so, and the main feature, however, of Maijishan is the Buddha flanked by the bodhisattvas that is carved into the mountain itself, that's visible from the floor of the forest. He's a seated Buddha carved into the mountainside. He's about 50 feet tall or so. Maitreya, or sometimes there's another bodhisattva who is thought to be on his left, and possibly Guan Yin on the right. That's the most likely scenario of the names of the two bodhisattvas that are with him. And I'll say a little bit more about them in just a minute, but I just want to show this video here. So this is a video that I took standing at the foot of the Buddha. And so you could get a sense of the size of this rock carving. And you see this is a person over here on the left. So if you can see the size of the rock carving relative to these people, is a very massive structure. And the reason why I think that this bodhisattva here might be Maitreya is because of this vessel. Maitreya often holds this kind of pendant vessel, but in any event, different people have different ideas about which bodhisattva that might be. So it's a very, very impressive carved structure. And what they did was they plastered over the rock carving. So this here in the center, what you see is the rough rock that's underneath, because the plaster that was put over it has fallen off. And one of the things that's interesting about this particular place, so Maijishan is not in very good condition. It's certainly not in as good condition as Mogao, even though they are doing what I think is their best to really take care of the place. But they had at one point, and I'll show the video again while I'm talking, they had at one point restored this bodhisattva on the right here, the Avalokiteshvara. And then a piece of it fell off. And rather than restore it again, they left it, and for safety reasons. But one of the things that happens quite frequently is that the visitors complain about that, because oftentimes folks have the idea that the conservators should just restore things back to what they thought it looked like originally, which contrasts very, very sharply with Western ideas of conservation. And these folks have often been trained in the West. In fact, we met with several of them who had actually trained together with one of our professors. Western ideas of conservation these days are more about preservation and stabilization, and not trying to restore something to our idea of what it previously looked like. All right. And you have some very unique objects at Maijishan, so I'm just going to share a few of them. You have this really beautiful standing Buddha that has a little seed in his hand. So again, how do we know it's a Buddha? We have this Ushnisha, and this one is very prominent, this one. You see that it's a slightly different style than the one I showed you earlier. Even the hair is different style. And again, that's because these sites were being carved and cared for over many, many centuries, and so the styles changed over time. And but we see the elongated earlobes, the Ushnisha, and we see the very simple style of robe here of the Buddha, of a renunciate monk. But again, this, and he's missing his left hand. That's what's here. Let's see if I can make it a little larger. He's missing the left hand here, and the left hand, or let me see, am I saying that right? He's missing the right hand, sorry. And the right hand, well, no. Yeah. Would have been in the Abhaya mudra, in the mudra of fearlessness, granting fearlessness, or sort of reassurance. And then you can see a little bit here in the left hand, you have this this seed. So sorry about the caption there. I'll have to correct that caption. The right hand is one that has this little seed in it. And it's quite an unusual object. I've never seen a Buddha that had that on it. And you can see that there's a little bit of shininess here on the fingertips. And that's because people started to touch the Buddha because they felt that the seed was some kind of symbol of, fertility or goodness, or some kind of wholesome gift from the Buddha. And so this is something that we often see with Buddhist devotional objects, that sometimes they bear this kind of evidence of having been touched frequently. I touched the seat of the Buddha. And now we'll look at cave 133. So cave 133 is one of the most fascinating caves, really. So now in Maijishan, many of the caves are quite small. They're actually called niches rather than caves. And many of them are very, very small. And you can see it's kind of like a devotional window, so to speak. And then you have a few caves that are deeper and that actually are, what we would think of as a cave, where you can step into a space that's carved in the rock. But cave 133 is fascinating for many reasons. One is because there are two people buried here. Another one is that there are 16 niches in the walls, not big enough niches for people to kind of sit down in, like for meditation. And we're not sure why the number 16 would have been significant, or whether it was significant at all. But another fascinating fact about this cave, and something that was a function of the cave sites in general, was that when they when they rediscovered this cave and started to preserve the site, they found that there were many of these stelae, these kind of rock carvings, carved reliefs, and that they were brought here from other locations for safekeeping. And they could tell by the kind of rock it was, or by the inscriptions. You can see there's an inscription here on this rock. And that was a very common practice, that the cave sites would be locations where things could be hidden away and kept safe during times of unrest, or times of warfare, or times when Buddhism was under pressure in various ways. So again, just looking at this particular stele, you have the lovely, lovely Bodhisattva here in the center, most likely Maitreya. So Maitreya is often, Maitreya Bodhisattva, who is the future Buddha, the Buddha of the future, the Buddha to be, so to speak, is often portrayed in this way with his legs crossed. If he's seated, he is portrayed in this way with his legs in this kind of X shape, rather than crossed like seated in meditation per se, because he's up on a little bit of a bench. And also because he has a little bit more adornment than a Buddha. So that would be my guess here, is Maitreya. And we have this interesting stele. So this stele is various points in the Buddha's life. There are of course, the stories of the Buddha. Here is his death, and here is his conception, And we have maybe some teaching going on over here, and various points, various important stories that would have been told using this kind of stone. So this kind of stone would be actually, described by a monk or a nun to folks to teach, to help them as a teaching aid for Buddhism. But one thing that I found really fascinating about this particular stele is this story of the Buddha's conception. And the story, as it's told, is that Maya, Queen Maya, so she was the chief consort of King Suddhodana of the Shakyan clan there in northern India. And she has a dream where a white elephant enters her side. And that is a moment of conception of the Buddha. And what's interesting about it is that if you go to the stupa site at Sanchi, so arguably the oldest known Buddhist site in the world, which is Sanchi Stupa, what you see is you see a reclining woman, and you see the elephant sort of descending down toward her. And then much later, centuries later, in Kizil, which is to the west of here and is one of the first of the sites in China, cave sites in China, we see a stele where she is reclining, Mahamaya is reclining, and the elephant is descending toward her again, but there's a boy riding the elephant. And now here in this stele, which would have been even centuries later than that, and that's one of the ways we know this fact, is the elephant descending not just with the boy, but also with the boy on a throne. So that's what this piece here is. This is the elephant. Maybe you can see the elephant's trunk right here, and the feet of the elephant, and all of this stuff is the throne on which this person here, this is the Bodhisattva here, this is the Buddha to be, the boy. And so it's a story in a sense of this particular stele it enables us to tell the story of how the status of the Buddha becomes elevated over time, and how these ways of thinking about the Buddha's story become more and more elaborate and reflect the, adoration that was given to him in later times through different cultural lenses. Another very unique object that is there at Kizil in the same cave. So this is the stele we were just looking at right here. And this is, you can see the upper part of the cave here. So here what you're seeing is you're really seeing how damaged the cave is. So you have the rock itself, and then you have a little bit of plaster that's been used here to stabilize, or it may be the original plaster that was put on. And then you see these blue marks. These are, or kind of purplish as they are in color these days, are paintings. This last remains of some paintings here. And so this site is seen quite a lot of damage. But in the same cave there with the steles is this beautiful statue of the Buddha. And this one, you can see again, it's quite a different color than the other kinds of stone that we've seen before. It may, in fact, have some plaster over it. It's hard to tell. Could be. And it is a unique depiction of him as a depiction of the Buddha with his son Rahula. So this person here, this is the back of Rahula's head and his ear. And you see he also has the elongated earlobes because of being from that royal family. Here he is. And Rahula becomes a monk in his childhood and practices with the Buddha. But this statue, interestingly, is of the Buddha, and the blue in his eyes, or so the docent told us when we were there, in the Buddha's eyes, is meant to depict him crying. Meant to depict him crying. And it's a very, very unusual way of thinking about the Buddha. Most folks from the mainstream Buddhist tradition would think that the Buddha as an awakened being doesn't cry, actually. And certainly wouldn't be crying over his son because he considered his son's becoming a monk to be a great blessing, and that they actually had quite a lot of contact with each other as monastics. But nonetheless, that is the story that's told about this particular piece. And it has, as you can see, these beautiful, beautiful hands that have survived, which we're very fortunate to see here. And again, even yet a different way of depicting the robes, right? A little bit more swoosh down here, a little bit more chest showing, still over the two shoulders. So over the two shoulders way of wearing the robe would mean the Buddha outside of the monastery. Okay, so before we go to Mogao, I'm just going to stop for a moment and see if we have any questions or reflections at this point. Yes, Becky.
At the beginning, you showed us the painting, and I wanted to know if the pigments are original.
Yes, the pigments are original, and I will talk a lot more about that, because what happens is that they have deteriorated over time, right? They have they change color from what they were originally. But yes, those are the original pigments. They don't paint over, thankfully. They have a policy at Dunhuang of not painting over and restoring.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, you're welcome. Okay, so we're going to go on, unless there are more questions. Don't hesitate. I'm not trying to rush. We have lots of time. We are going to do a little interactive thing, but not quite yet. Okay. So let me go back to sharing my screen. So we're going to look now at Dunhuang, at a different set of caves. And you could say that Dunhuang is really considered a national treasure. And part of the reason for that is that it's become really well known globally. And I didn't mention it before, but Maijishan is also quite popular. They see about 9,000 visitors a day. And that's quite a few. Oh, one more thing before I do that is to show you a little bit about this. So at Maijishan, the way that you access the caves is through these little walkways. So these lines that you see across the face of the stone, the face of the mountain, are walkways. And so people have to climb up these stairs and walk along these very precarious wooden walkways to see the various caves. That's how you access the caves at Maijishan. And the monastics live back this way at a monastery that's back here. But visitors go walk along these wooden walkways. And Dunhuang is quite a bit different, so we'll look at that in a second. But it's also known as the Dunhuang Grottos, the Dunhuang Caves, the Mogao Caves, the Caves of the Thousand Buddhas. So Caves of the Thousand Buddhas is used for many of them. That's actually referring to a particular painting style. So that's not unique to Mogao, although it is used here for Mogao. And the dates, again, from 4th century, middle of 4th century to roughly 1300 or so. So very, very long period of time that people were building caves, living in caves, painting caves here at Mogao. And it's near the city of Dunhuang. Dunhuang is a city, these days, a relatively small city, I would say, town, in this desert region of Gansu, northwestern area of Gansu. And it was originally established as a military outpost because it is accessible by both the northern and the southern routes, and so of the Silk Road. And eventually what happens is that it draws more people, and then there is this these monastics who come and they start to build these caves. And 492 caves have been preserved. It's thought that there were maybe almost twice that many originally, but 492 is still quite a huge number. And again, it's because of the earthquakes in this area that some caves have been lost, and also because of the sand. And we'll look in a moment at the actual structure of the wall that is where the caves are carved. But there are 45,000 square meters of painted murals of Buddhist texts, Buddhist themes of all sorts, and more than 2,000 sculptures that are here at Dungwang. And this is a photo that I took when I was there with my friends, some of my friends from school here. And what we're looking at is we're looking at the base of the 9-story pagoda. So this is the first story, second story, third story, and so on. It goes on up for 9 stories. And so this is the sheer cliff face in which you can see the doors of the caves, the openings of the caves, all along the cliff face. And this photo, I'm just giving it to you to give you even a sense of the scale before we look at some of the images of the different parts of the site. It's quite an amazing, impressive place. It's like looking at, when I walked up, I thought, it's like looking at an entire, couple of city blocks of apartments carved into a mountain. So this is a map of the site. Again, just to give you a sense of the scale and also what's there. So when you first arrive at Dungwang, the way that they do it now is you actually, in the town of Dungwang, you have to watch a movie, 2 movies, about the site and about the history of the site. And then you go by bus from that interpretation center to the actual site. And they did this for many reasons. One was just to reduce the traffic along the road. Between the 2 locations, everybody now has to take a bus. And also it's reducing the environmental impacts on the site. And it also helps them with crowd control. So they have very precise numbers about the visitors. So again, there is a cap on the number of visitors. On a typical day, they would allow about 9,600 people. On the 3rd day that we were there, it was a special day where they were celebrating the Buddha's birthday celebration, and they had roughly, they thought, about 18,000 visitors that day. And so it's built into a rock wall like this. So that pagoda that you were looking at, that's right here. And as you can see, there are caves that extend all the way out to the left, and then caves that extend all the way out here to the right of the pagoda. And there's another structure on this end. And then way out here, we have what's called the Northern Grottos area. So the wall runs north to south. And on the northern area, we have hundreds more caves that are not painted, that are smaller caves. They think these days, the theory is that these were the residences, actually, of the monks, and that the monks didn't actually live, for the most part, in these other beautifully painted caves, but that they lived over here in the northern section, and the artisans and other visitors. But there's also, an exhibition gallery. There's also a stupa to Wang Yanlu, and we'll talk about him in a moment. He was the caretaker at the site in the early 1900s, and he's honored actually for having taken up that role. And there's also an exhibition. The exhibition site was closed at the time that we were there for some construction. I believe it's open again now. But it's a very, very large site with, you cross a bridge here. It's dry as a bone at the time that we were there, which was in May. They say that sometimes, occasionally, there is water in here and it's a river. But it is the desert. It is most definitely the desert. And I'd say the main theme of Dongwang is the power of visual offerings. This is really, really important concept for us. So I did a research project on this cave, Cave 231. It is what's called a family cave, and that term family cave is jiaku, is translating a Chinese word, jiaku, which was from an inscription on Cave 220. And it is a cave, meaning that it was sponsored by one of the people who had some wealth in the area, and they would sponsor the carving and the painting and the statues in the cave and offer the merits to their parents. So I think I mentioned in one of the previous art history tours that there's a scholar who actually said something like the concept of filial piety, the concept of the children's care for and faith in their parents, which is very central to Chinese culture, was the main driver, in her opinion, of Buddhist art, even more so than devotion to the Buddha. So it's a very, very incredible statement, but that is one way to look at it, because a lot of these things were actually dedicated to parents and family. And this is a particular family, the Yin family. They were a very, very influential family in Dongwang. In fact, they were patrons of the largest Buddha statue, which we'll look at in a minute. And this is one of the sons of the ones, so a later generation, who gave this cave. And this cave, I would say, is very typical in many ways, which is, for one, you see that it is literally floor to ceiling painted. And we did actually do this process. We did some reconstruction of this process back in London to see how it works. And what they would do is to mix by hand clay with water and sand and some various kinds of, either hair or hay or things that would fibrously sort of help it stay together. Then they would apply that to the rock wall and allow that to dry, and then smooth again with water or with more clay until they had a surface on which they could paint. And then they would paint initially with lime, white lime underneath, to sort of seal it in and also to give a background for the painters to work on. And then they would grind up their own pigments, and the pigments were all mostly minerals and plants, and they would be ground together with animal glues. So rabbit skin glue or deer skin glue would be used to help the pigments to stay together, as distinct from European paintings, for example, that were often painted on wet clay. These were painted on dry clay, so they're secco style, not fresco style. And they were painted with these animal glues to hold the pigments together, as distinct from tempera paints, which are used oftentimes in Europe, which are based on egg whites. So, but what you see is this just complete immersion in a visual field of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas and donors and deities and all sorts of beautiful scenes. And the merit of that was what was being offered to the parents, or the patrons themselves would keep the merit of it. So this cave, Cave 231, has a fairly complex structure, but there are many caves that are like this in Dungwang. So you have this kind of, this is a drawing that a scholar did, Mr. Kayan, and he drew this, sort of architectural style drawing. So you have this entryway from the rock face into the cave, and then you have the carved space of the cave itself. And the cave has this sort of vaulted roof here. And then it has a niche in the back, the western wall, usually, is the primary niche. Yes? And that's where we would find most of the statues. So this is one style of cave. There are many, many, many different styles, and we'll look at a couple of other ones while we're here. But this is just to give you a sense of how much work goes into it, right? So these people are actually carving this out with a chisel by hand in the wall. Each cave would have had what's called a merit record carved into the outer portion, the entryway. In some cases, the entryways were lost, again, because of loss of the sheer face of the wall through erosion from the sand or from the earthquakes. But there were also texts, there were also copies of those merit records kept written down by hand that were found later on the site. So we know, for example, that this cave originally had 7 sculptures, but now there are only 3 of them left, and all of them show evidence of having been restored back in the 19th century. Even though the cave would have been built in what's called the Middle Tang or the High Tang Dynasty period. And the High Tang Dynasty period is a time when the Tibetans actually had control over the site, or were sort of caretakers for the site. Yeah, so please go ahead and mute your mics if you haven't already. Thank you. And yeah, is a time, again, of great artistic output. Something interesting about Dungwang are the studies about the artisans themselves, and this is of particular interest to me. I hope it's of interest to you too. So this scholar, Sarah Fraser, did a study of the records that were kept of people and materials coming in and out of the site. So there was somebody who was responsible for writing down when people were arriving and what materials they brought with them and when they were leaving and so on. And by studying that, what she did was she found that for the most part, the artisans who were actually doing these wall paintings were not the monks or the nuns. And that's quite common, actually, from what was the way that it was understood by the academics in years past. And her research says that she believes the monastic community was definitely consulted in all aspects of how the paintings were being done, and we see why here, and I'll say why in a moment. But that what the records seem to show is that there was a professional group of artisans who were painters, who were sculptors, who were metalsmiths, textile workers, who would come in and prepare the space once it was ready for that. And that they had actual rankings, they had different titles, and so on when they were coming in. And that is important because it tells us also something about how vibrant these communities were, how many resources and how much effort was really invested in these places. So if we look at an image like this is just one piece of one wall from that cave 231, and it's the 9 assemblies of the Avatamsaka Sutra. And so you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 Buddhas and their assemblies, their disciples, all gathered together. And it's part of a story that's told in this sutra, the Avatamsaka Sutra. And so just the amount of skill and complexity that would be required to paint this one piece, let alone all of the whole cave, tells us that, you know, hundreds of thousands of hours of artisans' time went into the site. And again, as an example of the complexity of the site, so if we look at just that one cave, 231, there are 6 different sutras that are being depicted there. We have the Saddharma Pundarika Sutta, which is also better known in English as the Lotus Sutra. Avatamsaka Sutra, the one that I just mentioned, which is flower garland in English. We have the Amitara Dhyana Sutra, which is the sort of jhana or the meditation state of the Buddha Amida. And then we have the Vimalakirti Nirdesa, which is near and dear to the hearts of many, because it's a story of a layman named Vimalakirti and his great debate with Manjushri Bodhisattva, with the Bodhisattva of wisdom, which he wins, of course. But the Bodhisattva doesn't win, the lay person wins. So it's a story about how lay practice can be thorough and lead to complete wisdom. And then we have Baishaguru, that's one of the Vajrayana sutras. And then we have the Sutra of Redemption from Indebtedness, which is a very specifically Chinese sutra. So again, imagine the complexity of these artisans' murals and the scenes that they're depicting. So many of the murals would be about the Buddha's life, the historical Buddha's life and his previous lives, and concepts such as these realms of paradises where the Buddhas and the Mahayana Sutras are said to live. So in the Pure Lands, the Western Pure Lands especially, but many, many of these sort of paradisical realms of Buddhas. And so, of course, as you know, we've pointed out in previous workshops, not only Buddhas are depicted, but also lay folks are depicted, monastics, deities of various sorts, or, you know, celestial beings of various sorts, and animals, offerings, people making offerings, and so on. The interior roof of most of these caves is made to look like a tent. So if you think about how people lived in that time, of course they had structures, but one of the ways that apparently the caves became one of the sort of standards, if you will, of the way that the caves were being made was to carve them as if they were these tents that you would see caravans living under in the desert. So again, this sort of Silk Road, very much a Silk Road related theme, even in the shapes of the caves that are carved. And the roofs themselves are often painted with dragons and phoenixes. That's a typical Chinese motif. Some of them have a central pillar, and we can look at that in a moment. A central pillar would be quite interesting because it would be a way, usually people would be understood to be circumambulating. They would be walking around in a ritual fashion around these pillars as part of their ceremonies. And as I said there earlier, the use of the caves is debated quite a bit. Some of the caves may have been used for meditation. They were most certainly used for rituals. They were considered offerings in and of themselves. There are some scholars who believe that the cave would be carved, it would be painted, it would be ceremonially blessed, and the merits shared, and then they would never use it again. That's one theory. And that they could be used as housing. There are some caves where again it seems that the caves were being used for housing. Again, not mostly. The current understanding is, my understanding as well as other scholars' understanding, is that the painted caves were probably not places where people were living. And the way that we know that, or the theory behind that, is because you don't see evidence of any kind of smoke. So the inside of a cave, even though we see these beautiful photos and they look brightly lit, the inside of a cave is absolutely black. There's no lights, there are no lamps, there was, no, of course, no electricity, there was none of that. So the caves are black. When you walk in with a guide who has a flashlight, and they shine on various parts of the cave. And that's how they tell the story, actually, and keep the whole crowd. And usually, 20 to 25 people would enter a cave at the same time. They could keep the crowd kind of following along with them. So the lack of any kind of evidence of smoke or other lamps being used in the caves seems to point to the fact that they weren't being lived in, at least not for periods of time. Although there were Russian soldiers, actually, who hid in the caves at one point in time. But that's another story. That's much, much, much later, obviously. Okay, so before we get to preservation, I'm going to skip forward a little bit to one bit of the story, and then we're going to pause and do our activity, and then we will look at some more art there. So this is the slide that I want to talk about right now. So exploitation and diffusion of art. So one of the most famous caves at Dongwang is called the Library Cave. It's number 17. It's right next to cave number 16, which is not always the case. The numbering systems can be quite random, and there are actually several numbering systems. So we're using this one that the Dongwang Academy currently uses. And cave 17 was discovered around the year 1900 by this Taoist monk called Wang Yanlu, who had just taken it upon himself to become the caretaker of the site. Nobody, he was not hired by the government. He was not a Buddhist monk. It's not really clear, but somehow he became the caretaker there. And in his caretaking, he discovered this cave. And it's called the Library Cave by us. No, it wasn't called that by him, because of these scrolls. So I'm showing you a picture here. And basically what happened was, let's look at the scrolls a little bit more. So all of these, you can see them wrapped up here and literally just piled one on another. These are all texts that are wrapped, sort of rolled into these scrolls, and then just stacked literally floor to ceiling in this cave. So now cave 17 is the smallest cave in Mogao. The cave next to it, cave 16, is the largest. And so this little cave was off to the side, and it was actually sealed. And Wang Yanlu finds it because the seal was falling apart, and it's stacked floor to ceiling and completely from door to the back with these scrolls of different texts. And then what happens is, a number of years later, Orelstein shows up. So Orelstein was a British man, who was sent by the British Museum and and the government of India, which at that time was the British colonial government. And he hears about these caves and thinks, oh, maybe I could find some of these antiquities that I'm supposed to be buying out there. And so he goes on expedition out to the caves. And right behind him is the French scholar, a French, what they call Orientalist at the time, a French scholar of Asian culture named Paul Pelliot. And he was also running an expedition and looking for antiquities to take home to France. And so this image is of Paul Pelliot in the library cave. The only reason that he could even be in the cave, and he's there with his dang candle of all the silly things in this cave full of scrolls. But the only reason that he could even be in the cave was because Aurel Stein had already taken out enough that you could get in the cave and stand there. So this whole section that we see with the painting of the tree was actually even full of different scrolls that by that time were in Aurel Stein's possession. And between the two of them, they purchased tens of thousands of scrolls for a pittance, literally, for a very, very small amount of money. They talked Wang Yunlu into selling them these things. He didn't really, he wasn't a scholar or even, again, a Buddhist monk, so he didn't really have a sense of the value of what he was selling. And so all but a tiny fraction of these scrolls have gone around the world now, to England, to France, to Germany, to other parts of the world. And there are very, very few, a very small fraction of them left in China. And in fact, one of the most important pieces of art, pieces of culture, Chinese culture that was found in the library cave is the world's oldest printed book. And the world's oldest printed book is not the Gutenberg Bible. It is the Diamond Sutra. It is a copy of the Diamond Sutra dated from 868, which is now in the British Library and on display, permanent display, in the British Library. And I'll stop sharing for a moment so I can show you this. There was a really good book written about this. It's called the Diamond Sutra book by Francis Wood and Mark Bernard. And they wrote a book all about a little bit about the race to get to the caves and sort of, there's some maps in here. There's some images of some of the other things that were found, art that was found. The scrolls, they are said to be about 90% Buddhist texts, and the other 10% was all kinds of things. Scrolls about medicine, about literature, about history. There were all sorts of things in this cave. And this copy of the Diamond Sutra is really quite beautiful. It has not only beautiful handwriting and script, but it also has a beautiful frontispiece, which has been more or less restored or sort of preserved by the British Museum. The beautiful image of the Buddha teaching the Diamond Sutra. Or actually, it's the Buddha teaching the Diamond Sutra to Subhuti, as that's a very important part of that image and of the story of the Diamond Sutra. But in any event, these things are not in China anymore. They are in England now. And one of the big questions that the world of art and art history and scholarship and preservation faces is the question of where should they be, right? Many objects, we talked about this in a previous workshop also, many objects were taken by the British because they felt they could take better care of them and that they would actually value them more than the places where they were. And that may may or may not be true. They were paid for in some cases, like these scrolls, you know, ostensibly purchased. And yet nowadays, you know, many countries, the governments of many countries and the museums of many countries have started to ask for things back. Now, the scrolls haven't been asked for, I don't believe. It's doubtful, you know, that these kinds of things would go back, except for the least valuable of them. For example, I would be quite surprised if the Diamond Sutra, for example, were to go back. Because to make such a request is a big, you know, there's a whole big political thing around that and the value of it and so on. But what I want to do is to stop for now and do a little bit of a breakout session, divide you into 2 groups, and you could have a chat about, what do you think about this? What do you think about art in places where it's not its origin? Yeah. So it's a complex question. I don't expect you to, you know, come to a resolution. Although if you do, definitely write a paper about that because people will want to know. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and break you up into 2 groups, and we'll just have about maybe 10 or 12 minutes of conversation around this, okay? And then we'll come back. And if you don't want to join your group for whatever reason, although I highly recommend it, then you can just don't say yes when it asks you, because Zoom is going to ask you whether you want to go to the breakout room. Okay, off you go. Right, so we're back from our rooms. Look like we might have lost a few people there, but
Group 1 is back in full.
okay, maybe that's the group 2 is still coming back. Five seconds and counting. Okay.
You really had us going.
Is that right? Okay, great. Do you want to say more?
Let's see if Emily or Claudia. Claudia, it was lovely to see you.
We can't hear you. I don't know why, because you're not on the interpretation. No? Here, hold on. I'll start it and then I'll stop it again and see if that helps. Okay, try it now. Not hearing you.
Maybe it's because she's got her earphones in.
Anyway, while Claudia is figuring out her technology there, does anybody else want to reflect on how the small group discussion was for you?
Our group spent a lot of time on ethics and precepts, and how does that, when things are taken that aren't freely given, what, but yet it is, you know, may you be safe, may you things be. So it's, there are some competing moralities there. We talked mostly about how it was wrong, I think, at least that's, but then what to do now, you know, to right wrongs once they're discovered, and how to rectify something.
Yeah.
And when to do that.
Yes.
We had a more sort of object-oriented talk, and with a lot of contributions from people about, well, the idea of entitlement, but also the idea that what would have happened to the objects if they had not been taken out of the caves, and the fact that they've been presented to the world currently, maybe they would have been anyway, so they can be appreciated. And then there was a contribution about that these are religious objects and they're taken away from the environment in which they were made to be used and appreciated and experienced. So we just sort of talked around those things.
Yes. Great. Yeah, it's a very thorny question, you know. It's a lot of dimensions there. There's all kinds of diplomacy and political and financial and religious and all sorts of different considerations there. Many, many. And it certainly is true that many more people get to see these objects because they are in some other part of the world, you know. And that doesn't, right. And then nowadays, that could change. And in fact, one of the things that the Chinese government is doing is that they have been making 3D printed replicas of the caves. And they've done digital replicas of the caves. And so they've done exhibitions of the caves in other parts of China and other parts of the world.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I keep thinking about all those wonderful northern people who came to preserve these things, and then they shot off the face of the Sphinx, and it lasted for 2,000 years. Are we really? Sorry, no. Stop.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, shall we move on then? Shall we carry on, or do we need a 5-minute break?
Can you hear me now?
5-minute break says.
No.
Claudia.
Oh,
Yeah, can
Claudia,
you hear
yes,
me?
we can hear you. Yes.
Oh, great. Can you put me in the cabin, please?
Okay, we'll put you in interpretación. Okay, great.
Are we having a break?
You have to unmute yourself, right? Yes, does everybody want a 5-minute break? Yes, let's take a 5-minute break then. All right, so returning to the second half of our art virtual tour. We're going to continue here with our study of Mogao, the caves at Dungwang. Yes, so these cave structures have been preserved. As we said, there are many hundreds of caves and many, many thousands of meters or yards of murals that are painted on the walls, on the ceilings. Many, many sculptures. And the sculptures are actually also done in a similar form to the walls, meaning that they are wood on the inside, sometimes with some metal to hold the pieces together, but then they're plastered and painted. And that was the standard way of doing it. Sometimes it's called stucco, although technically speaking, that's not exactly correct, but sometimes that's the word that's used. And nowadays, the caves at Dungwang are overseen by the Dungwang Academy, or sometimes also called the Dungwang Foundation. They are charged with the care of the site, and they also oversee Maijishan and a couple of other sites as well. And Mogao Cave site became a UNESCO World Heritage Site way back in 1987. So it's been a place of great appreciation of the art and the cultural and the religious meaning for a very long time. And the Academy is quite unusual in some way in that it is a public-private partnership in China. They conduct a lot of conservation research. They have developed some incredible science and techniques around studying the pigments, studying how to stabilize the rock face, the sands around the location. They're doing some cool work on whether you can use moss to apply to rammed earth, which is what they call these structures, to stabilize it in some way. Similar actually to what's been done in some places in Japan. And they're also, as I said, digitizing a lot of the site. And then, so what we have here, this is Cave 217 from a site called e-dungwang.com, e-dungwang.com, or Digital Dungwang. And it's a really wonderful resource. You see that they put their stamp here in the middle of everything, so I apologize for that. But it is a wonderful resource where you can see not only still photos, but they have like this 3D technologies in some of the caves, for some of the caves, where you can actually sort of feel like you're walking around on the inside. This cave 217, again, is a niche cave, as we were speaking about earlier. This is the west wall niche. But you can see here very, very clearly the roof style, right? So we have what's called the drapes on the side here, the drape of the tent, so to speak, figuratively speaking. And then you have the center part of the roof. And these lovely, again, it's not literally 1,000 Buddhas, but it's called the 1,000 Buddha style, where they paint many, 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 many hundreds of these small Buddha images along the ceiling or on the walls. And it's very beautiful. And a lot of the pigments have discolored, as we said before. So interestingly, for a long time, scholars thought that there were no yellows, but now, due to technology, they've found that there are yellows, like gamboge or yellow oxide, but they weren't able to see them because they have discolored. They've turned different colors, or oftentimes you see something that looks like black or very close to black of dark brown, and those are actually used to be reds because those are iron oxides that have oxidized. But this is the cave, one of the caves that I found really the most moving, to be honest. Is very, very beautiful, very large cave of the reclining Buddha in cave 151. And it is 51 feet long. It's quite a long, beautiful cave. It is depicting the death of the Buddha. So when you see a reclining Buddha in Thailand, for example, they believe that that is the Buddha just resting. But in most parts of the world, a reclining Buddha is a reference to the Buddha's death, is a reference to his dying at Kushinagar. And he was said to have lain down on his right side with his right hand under his head and his left hand on his hip, and very peacefully passed away. The face of this Buddha is, I believe, really beautiful, really, really beautiful, very peaceful face. And again, we have the Ushnisha, we have the Urna, we have these elongated earlobes of the Buddha. We have the Buddha with his robes over both shoulders. And we have also some very beautiful, just beautiful artistic decorative work here on the pillow of the Buddha, these kind of lotuses. And we have behind the Buddha, we have all the people, the deities and the monastics and the ascetics and the lay people who have come to see, to be present for the Buddha's death or to see his body. And so the whole length of the wall is painted with these faces of different beings. And again, one of the Middle Tang Dynasty, we'll have a look at some that aren't from that period, but this is another one of those. And we'll just pop out here for a second so you can get a sense of the size of this. One of the things that is kind of fun is that the Dungwang Foundation has a YouTube channel, and so they also do these beautiful presentations on YouTube that you can go and have a look, where they will walk through a cave and tell you a little bit about the history and the art of that cave. But this is just to show you a little bit of the scale of the Buddha itself. So here's this gentleman, Liu Gang is his name. He's one of the docents there. And the docents are all very thoroughly trained at Dungwang. They have to go through a thorough training process with the foundation, and then they shadow other experienced docents, and then they get to be docents on their own. So it's a pretty thorough training process so that they really know their stuff. They know the stories and the science that have been found out about these sites. So you can see that the Buddha is up on this raised platform. Again, there's this beautiful statue here and these images of the beings who have come to attend on the Buddha at the time of his death, and more or less the scale of the room itself. And the reason why this is an important part of Buddhism is because the Buddha's death is said to be the culmination of his teaching, right? It is, he very clearly said that all things are impermanent. And when it came time for his death, and Ananda, his attendant, Venerable Ananda, expressed a lot of dismay and concern and sadness, he said, "Venerable Ananda, have I not been telling you for more than 20 years that all things are impermanent, that all things have their cessation?" And so he demonstrates the peaceful passage of an awakened being. And that's why in the sort of early Buddhist traditions, or what are sometimes called the mainstream or the Nikaya Buddhist traditions, his birth, enlightenment, and death are all celebrated on the same day. It's a day called Wesak, V-E-S-A-K, Wesak. So this is a very common motif. And then we go to Cave 96. Cave 96 is the 9-story pagoda that I mentioned earlier in the presentation today. And before we talk about the pagoda, we can have a look at the way that Dungwang is set up. So there is this plain of sand and the sheer cliff face here. And then you see that the caves are carved into the cliff face here, along here. And there is a sand barrier, a kind of like a fabric sand barrier that has been put up by the Dungwang Foundation folks up here, because in the absence of that, what happens is that the sand just blows over the cliff face and falls down on the floor here at the base of the cliff and fills up all the lower caves with sand. That was the state of Dungwang when it was rediscovered. And they had to dig out all of the caves at the lower level. And as I said, there are 3 levels, actually, of caves at various parts of the site. But those lower caves are subject to, you can see that they have loss, very big losses sometimes of the painting. in the floor, from the floor level, up to where the sand had come in. And so now they try to keep this barrier up there. It's only moderately successful, I would say, and they're aware of that. But it is what can be done, given that nature is pretty powerful, and that's what's happening. In fact, the last day that we were there was what they called a mild sandstorm. The last day and a half or so that we were in the Dungwang area. And it was pretty intense, actually, to see how thick the air gets with the sand. But so this 9-story pagoda is the biggest structure on the site. It houses a seated Buddha Maitreya, and we'll look at the seated Buddha Maitreya in just a moment. It was built in 695 during the reign of Empress Wu Zetian. And Empress Wu Zetian was very, very avid Buddhist. She was very, very devout Buddhist. And during her time, all of, I would say, the cave locations really flourished, and there was a lot of activity. In fact, at Longmen, which is the one that was closest to the capital at the time, the main Buddha Maitreya is said to have her face, to have been carved with her face on it. Because there was a belief that the emperors and the empress, in this case, had that kind of divinity, and that's why they were in the position they were. And the pagoda has been repaired many times. That's why you see that it retains this red color, and it's been kept up because it's kind of emblematic for the site. And when you go inside the cave, this is what you see. So it's a grand scale. It's tremendous. When you stand at the bottom of at the feet of this Buddha, this is a Maitreya Buddha. You basically, like, this photo is very real, as you're like looking up his nose. Basically, it's an enormous figure. They have put these supports in there, and I believe that they're permanent. They're there all the time in all the photos I've seen. And they were there when we were there. And then there is this is the pinnacle of the pagoda up there, the top of it. And the pagoda is made of wood. We should be clear about that. I'm not sure about these inner supports. And this Buddha Maitreya, so what you see here, just to be clear what we're looking at, so we have this hand in Abhaya Mudra, right? We have, again, the right hand in the mudra of giving fearlessness, or reassurance, giving people a sense of not needing to fear the Buddha. And then we have this other hand, the left hand, is out flat with the fingers toward us, right? So this is the fingernail here. These are the fingers toward us on the knees of this Buddha that is seated, okay? That's what's happening here. And that hand out flat is giving the gift. So this Buddha Maitreya is said to be in the position of giving the gift of fearlessness. And in fact, the little Buddha that we have on our shrine here at Dassanaya also is in that same mudra. Mudra just means a symbolic hand gesture, and is a Sanskrit word. And so that's a very common Buddha mudra that we would see the Buddhas in. And so in any event, this statue is 116 feet high. It's been repaired many times. Our docent told us the only part of the statue that has never been restored is the face, that they respect the face, and they will clean it occasionally a little bit, but they do not, they don't try to fix it. And he said, interestingly, the docent said, the most important part of this statue is the dragons on the skirt. Which I guess he meant in terms of just artistic appreciation, aesthetic appreciation. That was what he usually points out to his patrons that come to visit this Maitreya Buddha. You see, again, a very ornate style of robe here and over both shoulders. And the one thing, and so this is a detail, this is a beautiful photo of the face from the IDP, the International Dungwang Program, another website with wonderful resources, lots of old photos there and sort of historical data that's been preserved. We see all the usual markings of a Buddha. Again, we see an Ushnisha, we see the urna, we see the elongated earlobes, we see the eyes kind of cast downward and relaxed and soft with that kind of inward gaze. So these are all the signs of the Buddha. Maitreya Buddha is particularly, I would say, associated with hope. Maitreya Buddha is the Buddha of the future. He was given the prediction by Shakyamuni Buddha. We see that in the sutras, the Nikayas, although many people think that that was a later addition, actually. And but in any event, Maitreya is said to be waiting in the Tushita heaven for when Buddhism dies out, as the Buddha has predicted, and then it'll be his turn to come and discover the Dhamma again in his final lifetime as a Buddha. So he, again, is sometimes referred to as Maitreya Bodhisattva or Maitreya Buddha. And it's said that when Maitreya Bodhisattva comes to become Maitreya Buddha, that is a time of great flourishing of humanity, that the crops do well and the illnesses are few and people live in peace. So it's very much a symbol of hope, Maitreya Buddha is. And for that reason, he's very popular, not only in China, but in Central Asia as well. And I want to say that my personal experience of this cave was really amazing. On the day of the Buddha's birthday, I wanted to do a little bit of an offering there. You're not supposed to leave anything in the caves, but I had a little bit of incense stick that I had kind of broken up. And I was in my robes, my okesa, and I went in there with my group, the folks from my group who wanted to come together, and it was packed. Of course, it's jam-packed. There's tens of thousands of people there, and but the guard let us kind of stand there at the feet of the Buddha. So there's a glass partition so that you cannot touch the statue itself, but we were allowed to stand there at the glass partition and not have to kind of move through with the crowd. And I did some chanting, and I was immediately struck by the way that the sound resonates in the space. The whole cave fills with sound when you stand at the feet of this Buddha and chant. And so much so that all the people who were kind of milling around us all stopped. And we had a really lovely moment to chant the Metta Sutta with this Buddha. But it really speaks to, I believe, the care and the thoughtfulness of the design of these caves, that they were in use. They were designed for ritual use, and especially this one in particular. And then Cave 257, we're just going to talk about this again because of its emblematic design. It's one that's quite well known. What we have, it's called the 9-colored deer cave, and that's because we have this design on the wall there, and the design has all the celestial musicians at the top. The Apsaras is the Sanskrit name for the celestial beings who are up there. And then there is this host of Buddhas, right? So as we've said, the 1,000 Buddha motif. We see it everywhere in Dungwang. Each one of these little individual Buddhas painted on the wall there. And then below here, then at the bottom here, so just I would say slightly below eye level, maybe like waist level or so, if I recall correctly, is the Jataka tale. And a Jataka tale is a story of the historical Buddhas, so Shakyamuni Buddhas, past lives. And they generally are like morality tales. They're encouraging people to cultivate the paramitas, especially the paramita of generosity and patience. So the Jataka tales are very much understood that way, to be teaching the Buddhist values. And this particular tale is about the 9-colored deer. So again, it's telling the story of the Buddha in his past life. So he was the 9-colored deer. And as I said recently to someone, it's interesting because in many of the Jataka tales, the Buddha is an animal. And that's not perceived to be anything bad. It's still part of a very uplifting story, and a story in which the Buddha has the capacity to do good things with his life. And yet later on, what happens is that because other parts of the suttas describe the animal realm as being the upper part of the lower realms, meaning below human beings, and part of the lower realms of existence, rather than the upper realms, which are the celestial realms, then becoming an animal in your life, or having been an animal in your previous life, is looked down upon. It's like something bad happened. So it's a very interesting, sort of tension within Buddhist teachings. What is the meaning of a lifetime as an animal? But in any event, the 9-colored deer has all these beautiful spots in different colors, and his companion there, and this very, very stylized form of depicting the people and the king. This is the king at that time, and their clothing and the horses. And the mountains here is a very, very stylized form of depiction. And the story is about the Buddha having saved the life of a man who was drowning, who turns out to be his cousin Devadatta in the Buddha's actual life here as Shakyamuni Buddha. That was Devadatta's previous life. So they were related even back then. And so it's a story about helping others. And then actually what happens is that Devadatta tells the king where this fancy deer is, and the king comes to kill the deer, or to, capture the deer. But then the deer tells the story of having saved Devadatta's life. And so the king spares him. So the story is something like, if you do good, then good will come to you, or you will be okay. You will be safe. And the other thing we see here is this cartouche in the middle. So oftentimes what we see in Mogao is these small, narrow, rectangular shapes where the details, or the kind of bare outline of the story, would have been written on the wall to help the monks to interpret. And you can't see with the naked eye, you cannot see the characters in these cartouches anymore. But recently, in the last 10 years or so, I believe, the Dungwang Foundation has developed some technology that they can actually read sometimes the letters in the cartouches and see the words that were there. And that helps them, of course, to identify the text that is being depicted there and make sure that it matches up with our idea of what story it was. So, and this image, interestingly, has now become an iconic image for Mogao. You can get it on a tote bag, you can get it on a postcard, you can get it on a coaster. It's like that. It's kind of like Van Gogh's, sunflowers. It's very, very well-known image in the area there. And some other novel imagery that we see there at Mogao. So you see these kind of raised platforms, right? The statues are up on the raised platforms. And interestingly, sometimes they would carve or paint these niches so that they look like a sofa. So it's kind of an interesting way of suggesting that the Buddha might be sitting there on your parents' sofa and teaching them. That's a little bit of the implication there, but in any event, it is something that you can see on the walls there, which also tells us something about the culture of the time and the way people lived, and sort of what their living rooms look like. And then we also see very, very unusual, again, imagery of different kinds of Buddhas, different kinds of deities. This one is again from that cave 231 that I did the study on, and it is a two-headed Buddha. So I'll make this much larger so you can see here. It is a two-headed and four-armed Buddha. So how do we know, again, that it's a Buddha and not a Bodhisattva? Well, it has the Ushnisha and the urna, on both of the two heads, and the elongated earlobes, and the robes, the very, very simple robes of a Buddha, and yet, and the nimbus, and yet it's very, very, we would say, strange to imagine a Buddha with four arms and two heads. That would be much, much more indicative of a Hindu deity or of certain kinds of bodhisattvas. So, for example, we would see Kuan Yin Bodhisattva or Avalokiteshvara, as they are known in Sanskrit, having many arms or having four arms. That would not be unusual. But for a Buddha, it is quite unusual. And my friend Lan, who is one of the graduate instructors there at the Kortol, translated this cartouche, because this cartouche is quite easily readable, more or less. And she said, well, it could be saying this. It could be saying the miraculous image of a two-headed Buddha named Gandhara, or it could be saying the miraculous image of a two-headed Buddha from the country of Gandhara. So Gandhara, as we've spoken about in some of the other art workshops, was an area of what is now Afghanistan and Pakistan in Central Asia. And it was an area of a great flourishing also of Buddhist art. In fact, we think that some of the earliest, if not the earliest, figural depictions of the Buddha come from that part of the world. And one body and two heads is interesting because the docent said that the way that she was taught was that this meant that there were two donors for this particular part of the cave. And therefore, because they came together to make one cave, then they get one Buddha with two heads. And yeah. And again, we looked at that, the library cave, and then just a little bit about the conservation. So again, there are hundreds and hundreds of caves, and this is a really impressive organization that takes care of this place. So what we're seeing here is a huge, huge monitor on the wall. This whole panel here, that's a monitor. And this gentleman, this is a scientist who's standing in front of it. And I'll just open this up a little bit. Each one of these little green dots is a cave that is being monitored, right? So there are hundreds of them. And you can see here on the screen, they are being monitored for three things. They're being monitored for CO2, carbon dioxide. They're being monitored for the temperature inside the cave, and they're being monitored for the relative humidity. That's what this percentage thing is. And those three things are important for several reasons. The first reason is variations in the temperature and in the humidity are very hard on the paintings, on the wall structure. The more variation there is in the humidity and in the temperature, the more that the plaster tends to crack, and the parts of the wall, parts of the paintings tend to fall off. And so they keep the caves enclosed. Almost all of the caves are enclosed with these metal doors, and many of them are behind glass, either partially or fully. And the CO2 is also interesting. So now CO2 is, what we're breathing out when people are in the caves. And what they found was that the CO2 levels get too high and people get uncomfortable. People would faint in the caves, or people would feel very uncomfortable, like they couldn't breathe. And they also find that, again, that correlates oftentimes to an increase in moisture in the cave, because we're breathing out water as well as heat. And so that also leads to problems. So they monitor these three things continuously with all of this electronic equipment that is inside each of the caves. If the caves get beyond their prescribed level, they will actually close a cave and not allow any more visitors that day. So what we can see over here is we have a couple of caves with a yellow mark, means that they're getting too high, but they're not over their maximum measurement. And we have several caves, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 caves here with a red dot, meaning that they are above their prescribed CO2 level, or their prescribed temperature, or their prescribed humidity level. And those caves will be closed. They send the guards out there, the security folks out there, and tell the docents that they can't bring people in those caves anymore. And in any event, most of the time, the vast, vast majority of visitors, even though there are 3 million visitors per year or so, the vast, vast majority of visitors are only open to see about 40 caves of the hundreds that are there under surveillance. And this is, again, one of the great questions of our ability to preserve the caves, is that oftentimes the impulse is then to shut them down and to care for them, to make them not available. So for example, Cave 285 was a cave that one of our instructors worked on, and she was with the Getty Conservation team, and they invested, thousands of hours of many, many scientists' time and many, many resources, and restored the cave to the maximum degree that's possible. And then the cave is closed to visitors now, because nobody wants anybody breathing on the paintings. So that happens very frequently. Unfortunately, in the conservation world, this kind of antiquities get locked away. And in any event, that was my last slide. And so much, as I said, we're just really scratching the surface of these sites. But you get a little bit of a taste of the visual impact of a place like that. And the devotion, just the tremendous devotion that goes into it. So. Any other questions or reflections? We could actually do a little walkthrough. We have a few more minutes. We could actually go to the digital Dungwang site and sort of do a little walkthrough of one of those caves with the central pillar. You want to do that? Yeah, gives a thumbs up from at least one person. One more person. You all can drop off if you get too tired, but we are not actually at our 8:30 time, which was when we were going to end. Let me get it up on my screen first before I share it with you. So give me just a moment here. Yeah, so not this, well, that's the library cave. Maybe we'll do that one too, but yeah, so let me pull this up, and then you can see actually how you can find it for yourself if you want to geek out, and you can go see your caves on your own. Yeah, great. So this is Digital Dungwang. It's a site that is run by the Dungwang Academy. And you see the URL there. And as I said, all of this information is also in the slides, which you will get a chance to access if you like. And they have digitized a variety of caves, ones that they think are emblematic. Interesting to see always what they have digitized and what they have not. So for example, the two caves that we looked at with the reclining Buddha and with the seated Maitreya are not digitized. For one, I think they're just too vast, but also because I think they're focused on the 3D printing of those. They did a really beautiful 3D printing of the reclining Buddha at one point. But in any event, it's also, you can imagine, a huge task that's going on. But let's look here at cave 254, in part because this is one of the earliest caves, very, very early style of it, but also again because it has this beautiful central pillar and has a ritual function that we want to talk about for just a moment. So you click on your cave here and it tells you what the cave number is. And again, we're using the cave numbering system that is currently used by the Dongwang Foundation. It is the Orelstein numbers, I believe. And there are also the Paleo, the French had their own numbering system and the Chinese had their numbering system and so on. But we're using this one, which is the one that's most commonly used. It tells you what dynasty it's from and roughly what period of time. The cave form, so as I said, there are many different sort of styles that the caves fall into, and they're all quite unique. I mean, they were all, you can tell that they were made by hand. You know, this is not a cookie cutter kind of operation by any stretch. When it says construction time here, that means when this digitization was done and by the Dongwang Academy. So this is the central pillar here in the cave. So notice, first of all, the shape of the roof is quite different than the ones we've seen before. Yeah. And the style of the painting here is also quite different, right? This has, to my eye, a much more kind of Central Asian style to it than the later Chinese styles that we see in the other caves, right? And you have these niches on the wall with other Buddhas, larger carved Buddhas, and you have your 1,000 Buddha there along the wall as well. But there's this central pillar around which they would do the circumambulation. And see if we can find the little 3D. Here's the 3D. It's pretty cool. So it's loading, and it's going to take a little while to load because we're on Zoom, so that is always a thing. Let me see if I stop sharing, maybe that will help it to load up for a second. We'll go back there. And I will close this one. And we'll give it another chance to load. Yeah, I think it might not be able to do it while the Zoom is running because there's already too much video that's trying to cross over. And yeah, it's not willing to load, but you'll have to have a look later on. It's the kind of thing where you see, you know, like sometimes you see that real estate folks will do this, where it has a little arrow and you can kind of walk forward and then you can kind of turn this way or that. They have that there. And the interesting thing, I'll tell you that what our docent said about the caves where they do circumambulation, he said, bad luck gets locked up inside the central statue when it's circled, when it's walked around. So that was a belief behind the ritual, apparently, according to what's come down to us at this time. But I will say that for example, in Japanese Zen tradition, circumambulation is a big part of the practice, and there's no belief about bad luck or anything going on there. It's really something about embodiment and about sort of honoring this being. Because what we see in the suttas is that people would come and approach the Buddha, and it says they would approach him respectfully, and they would sit down to one side, or they would, sometimes they would kind of go around. That's an Indian cultural way of honoring a person as well. So it has its own history, its own ritual history that I don't think is related necessarily to the bad luck, but somehow it got that idea that it had that benefit too. So look one more time and see if it's loaded. No, it's, I'm sorry folks, but with the Zoom running, I don't think that it's going to be able to come up. Yeah, let me try another one just in case there's another option here. Oh, actually this one is already open. Aha, we'll try this one. This is not the central pillar cave. This is the library cave actually. But let's have a look there. Yep. So this one is a bit unusual in that you see there's this kind of empty area here, and they did that again because a good part of the cliff face had fallen off and they needed to stabilize it. And because this is one of the most, these two caves are a couple of the most important caves in the space. And you see these cords over here where they do kind of Disney style or, you know, sort of crowd control style of having people wait. But we'll see if we can get this to work. So go forward. Aha, it worked. Or well, it's sort of loading still. Yep. So this is the antechamber. This is the part before you walk in and see the main part of the room. And on the right-hand side, so we're looking at the right-hand side of the hallway as you've walked into the cave. And there is this little window. And so this is the library cave. This is why it was hidden, because this section had actually been closed off, or at least partially closed off, to keep the things inside. Now you'll see that it's empty. Let's see if it'll let us step into the library room. Right. So it's a very, very small cave, and they've put this image of a monk, that monk that was there, caretaking, in the room. But it's a very, very tiny little room like this. You see, they put a little electric light, so you can see this is the window that we just kind of stepped through, figuratively speaking, and the walls in the similar form that we've seen before of plaster. And there's this whole stele here telling a little bit of the story of what happened. So let's see if we can go back out. No, we'll go back out this way. And then we'll see. So if you can imagine, that whole little room was floor to ceiling with scrolls. And then we turn this way and we can see the main room. And it's beautiful, as I said. So cave 16, this is 17 is the library cave, this little alcove to the side. And then cave 16 is the largest of the caves, even larger than the one with the reclining Buddha. And we're going to see if it'll let us go back there. Doesn't look like it, huh? Let's see. A little bit this way. And maybe I can just, oh, there we go. So there is the central image there in the back wall, what is the west wall of this cave. And you can see how large it is. You can see that there's this whole roof, again, this kind of tent style roof. And there is this Buddha with this pillar at his back, and they're up on this platform, this kind of rectangular platform. And there's a glass piece here to keep people from walking further back, but you could, back in the day, and they did, leave offerings here and do offerings and ceremonies to this Buddha. And the other interesting thing you can see from here is that you can see also that oftentimes there were other beings who were painted on the walls leading into the caves. And in this case, these are bodhisattvas, I believe, with the halos on their heads, or they would have been the disciples of the Buddha. We can't see their faces, so we can't tell. But oftentimes later on, and again, this is an earlier cave, this is about a 9th century cave, I believe. Later on, who we see painted here were the actual patrons. So we see beautiful images of folks in Chinese dress of antiquity. So that is a little tour of a cave there. So you can see what that looks like. Yeah. So that's it, everyone. I hope you really enjoyed it. I hope you learned a little something and got a feeling for the site. And yeah, if you put your email there in the chat, then I'll send you the evaluation form and a link to the slides and the recording. So the other 2 workshops are already up on the YouTube, and we'll put the recording for this one up there. That'll be the complete set for this first part. And then maybe later in the year, I will do a couple of workshops on my thesis, on the objects from Northern India, and also on the Smithsonian Museum, because the Smithsonian has many wonderful pieces of art as well. So we've been there in person before, but we might do a virtual one too.
Thank you so much. This is so generous and rich and really impactful. So thank you.
Yeah,
Wonderful. Wonderful.
quite spectacular. I had no idea how amazing this place was. So it was wonderful experience. Thank you.
Lovely. That's great.
Yes, marvelous, marvelous. Thank
Have
you.
a wonderful trip to India. I mean, to
Yes,
India, yes.
yes,
Oh,
to
yeah.
India and Nepal. That's right. I leave on Thursday, so
Safe travels. Thank you.
thank you so much.
Yes.
Enjoy it.
Happy trails.
Good night.
Thank you.
Good
Bye.
night.
Thank you.
Thanks, Claudia. Thanks, Linda.